one of the things I want to start off by saying is um, I have kind of avoided doing many programs on Asian art um, because it is a vast and deep tradition that has a lot of nuances and subtleties to it that really are a challenge for a Western mind to grasp. I've always loved Chinese and Japanese paintings, but know that I have a great deal of respect for the tradition that this comes out of. So that with the provisor, I'm going to dive in anyway. Ukiyo-e prints, The Floating World. This is actually an art that was for the people. The tradition of the Japanese print during the Edo period was really creating art that the middle class, that the working class could afford to live with. Unlike paintings and screens and things like that, which really were for the aristocracy, for the shogun class, for the ruling elite, these pieces were made for everyday people. So the shows that I'm going to review at this point: The Floating World, Japanese prints at the Worcester Museum, and Hokusai, Inspiration and Influence at Boston. The Floating World, the Japanese prints, is on now, and the Hokusai is coming in March. The Bancroft collection that is at the Worcester is 3,700 prints. They have a show on right now of 50 of those prints, many of which have not been seen before. They keep these, in low light situations so that they can, preserve the color. Okay, so the show focuses on the Edo period, which is 1603 to approximately 1868. The shogun held a pretty tight rein on travel and on who came into the country for that period of time. There was trade with, I believe it was the Dutch. There was one port that was open to the outside world, but that was it. So, in fact, Commodore Perry, when the heck was it? 1853, 1854, something like that. More or less opened Japan to trade at kind of gunpoint. And one of the things that happened out of that was a really vigorous opening up of the craft and print market to the West. So they really the prints are very interesting, because what they would do is they would create a print. A publisher would hire an artist to do a drawing, and then a really fine craftsman would carve the actual plate in wood. He would carve the wood um, and that would be inked and then printed. They did basically, there was somebody who specialized in carving the wood. There was somebody who specialized in inking the plate and printing. Throughout that whole thing, the publisher actually had a lot of say on the colors and how it was printed and all of that. But there's a number of craftsmen involved. The artists did the drawings, but they didn't necessarily have full say on what colors were used and how they were inked. In some cases, yes. In some cases, not much. They would do very large runs of these prints. So I'll talk more about this later. Let me push on. This is a beautiful example of a hokusai print. And you can see in this some aspects of Western perspective, which was something that hokusai would have been exposed to through the import of some images from the West, from prints and things like that, from etchings and that kind of thing. So you can see this boardwalk that gets smaller as it goes up in the distance and things like that. So it's a combination of Western perspectival and the overlapping of forms, which is really the kind of traditional approach to Japanese image making. And so the influence of Japanese prints on Western art was very profound. And this is an image by Hiroshige that Van Gogh copied. And basically Van Gogh and his brother was an art dealer. Vincent actually worked with his brother as selling prints and art in Paris for a period of time. So he was exposed to the influx of these prints when things opened up in the 1850s. The import market, like I said, these prints were abundant. Any really good edition, they could print as many as 2,000 of these prints. They would do them in runs of about 200 prints each time they'd run it, but they were very large editions. In comparison to what we are used to today, which is a run of 75 to 150. So, it's really the arrangement, the composition, the business of this point of view that was, opening up really unique possibilities of composition to a Western mind and Western eyes. And Van Gogh recognized that. And here is another set, the remarkable fine lines that are in this woodcut. This has to be cut out on a cherry wood block, and leaving those really fine lines in there is really tricky. So the craftsmen that were actually cutting the blocks really knew what they were doing. They were very developed in this. And basically, there are a number of really common themes that were used. Courtesans, geisha, actors in theatrical scenes, landscape and seascapes, even, basically still lives, working people, fishermen, hikers. So these were subject matters that were thrown in. I mean, somebody like Hiroshige did well over 4,000 prints, drawings for prints, and those prints were produced from the publishers. So there was a lot of flexibility in how they were approaching these things. Okay, and what the Europeans and Americans took from these pieces, the asymmetrical composition, the limited palette, the shifting shapes, simplifying forms. Somebody like Whistler was very familiar. I mean, Degas, Whistler, William Merritt Chase, Mary Cassatt, Monet, Manet, all had collections of Van Gogh. All had collections. Gauguin had collections of Japanese prints, and they were looking at these broad areas of color and big simplified forms. But there's this sense of composition and rhythm that's in these pieces. And again, this shows a clear example of what I'm gonna call a key block. Okay, what they would do is they would cut they would take the drawing, glue it to the panel, the wooden panel, and then carve into that panel, carve out the empty spaces and leave those linear elements. And so what they would do is do a key block, which was just the black print. And then they would carve the other blocks using that key block as the guide. So they would cut blocks for each of the other colors and then print that. So basically what would happen is they would print the key block, transfer that drawing onto the other panels, and then cut out the rest of the panel and leave raised the area that was going to get color. And then they lay those pieces of paper over the block with a register mark, which is these little things in the corners so that you can get it to be right. It's very tricky and complex, and it makes these pieces that much more remarkable. And people like Monet, did these wonderful, wacky, Japanesque pieces, from the kimonos and from the other things, that the fans that were being imported and all that. And on the right, you see one of William Merritt Chase's daughters with a portfolio of Japanese prints strewn across the studio floor. And since travel in the late 1800s had been opened up, one of the things I want to get back to is that the shogun had a really tight rein on everything that went on. There was a really very rigid class structure in Japan. And when things opened up in the 1850s, before that, people were not allowed to travel. They were not allowed to go go to Europe, to go to America. They were not allowed out of the country, really, more or less. That was my understanding, anyway. And so when they were allowed to travel, the Japanese artists went to Paris and they learned the Western techniques and Western compositional things, but there's also something that you can see here that is very lyrical. There's a charming quality to it that this is a Japanese artist that was in Paris. He came to America first, then went to Paris. But you can see the compositional elements, the kind of lyricism in the drapery and the use of color. And again, Degas. There's an intimacy in these casual scenes that Degas picked up on, and this is a very different approach to art making and to what is legitimate subject matter for painting. So there is this everyday element in the Japanese print that gave kind of permission to explore different subject matter for the Western artists that were seeing this stuff. Now, that's not to say that the Western artists really understood the depth of the tradition that they were taking this stuff from. They were seeing certain compositional things. They were seeing fresh points of view. They were seeing certain aspects of it. But there's a lot more to this than that. Again, with the sense of overlapping planes in this Degas, you can see, you know, he's playing around with this in a really different kind of way. There's also photography that comes into it. That's a different matter. But the points of view, there's the limited palette, though Degas went pretty far pushing that. It's still basically this kind of beigey yellow against blue green, and you know, looking at the subject matter, this still life on the shelf, and this business that's going on with the blossoms and the figure in the Japanese print. There's a definite relationship that's going on there. So by the 1880s, the Western influence can clearly be seen in Japan. These Japanese women dressed in Western gowns, and the image of this you know, new technology, the steel bridge that the Japanese were very proud of at that time, that they were modernizing and bringing all that into Japan. And notice behind this central figure, this woman, there's a little image of Mount Fuji. We're going to see a lot more of that as we go further along in this presentation. But you know, this bridge and these technical innovations and all that is not too much of a big deal to Americans, since they had plenty of bridges around. But there was a big following and a big opening up to the Japanese print in America. There were collectors that were buying, hundreds and hundreds of prints. So there was a very clear market that was out there for them. Okay, now, I am going to focus mostly on Hokusai and Hiroshige, though there were many printmakers and many artists and many beautiful, beautiful prints from a lot of other artists. I'm going to focus in on Hokusai and Hiroshige, just for sanity's sake, number one, but number two, they were two really great artists who produced some really wonderful prints. So this fabulous, elegant image is one that I wanted to focus in on for a little bit. It's a kind of cubistic image in a certain way. I mean, this waterfall, these really elegant tendrils of the water flowing down this falls, and these big organic shapes of the landscape in front of it, this kind of layering that's going on here. It's a very cubist image. If you look at it, you look at the river that's up at the top, and we're looking kind of down at something that we probably in reality couldn't see. If we're looking up at the waterfall from here, how are we able to see the rhythms in the river that's behind it? So it's an interesting juxtaposition of natural phenomena in a kind of invented setting, shall we say. The simplicity of the color, this Prussian blue, which they really loved, yellow and green is, there's a little bit of a hint of a sienna red in there, but very simple colors, but beautiful, organic, abstract forms. And that's one of the things that Western artists also picked up on from the Japanese prints. Again, working class images. These guys are basically hiking along the trails. They're bringing carting food to the market, cleaning up, sweeping. Very humble subject matter in certain ways. Everyday occurrences in this beautiful setting. Again, we have these really intriguing points of view, that they would pick up on. Now, basically they would do these small drawings. They're not very big, and then they would enlarge them to the block size. The blocks standard size is somewhere around, in this case, would be around 9 or 10 by 14 or 15 inches wide. And so they weren't gigantic, but that was kind of the more or less the standard size. They would do things that were half size and quarter size also, but most of these are fairly decent in that, you know, that scale. So there's this interesting juxtaposition of Western perspective and traditional overlapping forms that are in many of these pieces. And again, we see Mount Fuji off in the distance. So there were a couple of highways that connected Edo and which is Tokyo, Edo and Kyoto and the other big cities. There were two major highways, and they would walk these highways. So there were these inns that were set up along the way to give a place to rest, a place to sleep, a place to eat while they were taking these journeys. And some of these journeys on foot would take 2 or 3 weeks, if not longer. But the interesting business of what's going on here with this composition. Look at this beautiful composition. There's these negative spaces where, you know, basically the blossoms, these blossoming trees are coming up into the sky. It's really kind of this central burst of blossoms in this landscape. And again, the overlapping forms going into the distance. So it's not about the Western railroad tracks. It's really about overlapping shapes that creates the space. And this, again, is the back of Mount Fuji. So we're looking at it from a different point of view. These big forms, these big, generous forms are really, you know, classic, you know, this cloud that's kind of like in this valley, you know, behind the trees and behind this foreground stuff, and then Mount Fuji and the mountains in front of it. Really interesting composition, and really clear where the key block is in this one. You can see the linear elements and the blocks of big dark colors. And here's the mountain itself. So the colors that were used to depict Mount Fuji are actually things that happened during particular times of day. I'm not sure when I grabbed this archival shot of Mount Fuji. I say 1910. I'm not really sure when it was, but it is an archival one from somewhere between 1900 and 1920 or 30. But you get the idea. Now we're gonna look at Mount Fuji by Hokusai. And what I wanted to do was let you see 4 different versions of the same print. And what would happen, again, the print publisher would have a say in what colors were used, how those colors were applied, and all of that. There's a printmaker who actually applies the inks and pulls the print. The blocks themselves were were cherry wood, I believe, for the most part, which is a very hard wood. It will hold up for a very long time, so that they could do these runs, these different editions. So if you look at these different versions of it, of Mount Fuji, you can see how the ink is applied to the panels in the different layers, and you can see in some places the brushwork is actually left on there. You know, in other places you can see the grain of the wood showing. So there's also things like, well, let me see if I can pull up my zoom and go in a little bit closer. So when you look at this, you can see this white line that's in here. That's actually a registration thing between the two colors, where they moved the block over a little bit. You can see that's different here. And again, you can see the difference in color. And as I said, they would do these in runs of 200 when they arrived at an image. And I'm sure that there were lots of Mount Fuji from this print that were pulled. Let's see. So you can see the real variation and different possibilities in the printing process that can actually produce very different effects. Okay, and the Great Wave is probably one of the more famous images. This is again, it's Hokusai. And there's Mount Fuji, dead center, still in there. It's probably, it's a very expressive piece. Hokusai was not afraid to go into some pretty terrifying spaces. So imagine that you're in one of those boats with a giant wave coming at you. There's some people that call this tsunami, but it's really just called the Great Wave. And Hokusai was a very interesting guy. He was not, like I said, he was not afraid to go into the more terrifying forces of nature, and into the more terrifying aspects of human nature, and the spirit world. I mean, basically, he did these ghost prints and he did these kind of demon prints. They're pretty scary, and I'm going to show you one right now. Okay, these are both Hokusai prints, and they were from ghost stories and all that. Matters of the spirit world were not forbidden territory to these artists. Politics could get an artist in deep trouble. In actuality, there were times when artists were thrown into jail for representing something that had political connotations that the ruling elite did not like. So now we're going to move on to Hiroshi. And he also did his 36 views of Mount Fuji. They're very different from Hokusai. Very beautiful. subtle, elegant, refined, more colorful. Um, he used a lot of a pretty broad, a much broader range of colors in his pieces. Um, the overlapping forms, less dependent on Western perspective. Um, but beautiful shapes, beautiful, serene quality to these pieces. Now, this again, there's this whole travel thing. There's this inn here, and these travelers in the foreground. Um, okay. I'm going to show you the breakdown of the plates on this particular print. I mean, it's a lovely print, fairly simple in comparison to some of the others. But I'm going to show you basically how the key plate worked and how the other colors were printed under or onto that key plate. So if you look at the top left, you can see this is really the key plate with the black linear elements. And what they would do is they would take that print, they would print it and then reverse it onto the other board that they're going to do the colors on, and print that onto there, and then cut out everything that was not going to print and leave those areas like these trees, and print the color into those trees and those little boats and the figures. And that's the procedure. They would go on from there. So you can see the stages of the different colors that were printed from that key block. And there's these gradients that happen in there. That's how they roll up, how they would roll up the block. So they would do gradients within that, like going from darker blue to lighter blue in the water and things like that. This, as I said, this is a fairly simple, straightforward print. They used a lot more gradients and things in different pieces. Let me move on to this. And they were not afraid to use really vibrant colors either. They're not chained to naturalism. There's a fidelity to the underlying forces of nature, but it's not about copying nature. It's about catching a certain kind of vitality in the thing. And the compositional elements, I mean, basically these really fresh points of view. These are spectacular prints. I mean, just amazing things that Hiroshige did. And again, you see this gradient in the blue that's in the one all the way on the left, and the gradients in the sky where it's going from that magenta in the top into the blue into the red right at the edge of the horizon. This would be rolled up on one plate, and then the water would be another plate. So they're really fabulous pieces. Each one can really be considered a unique piece of art because, you know, the variations in how they're inked and how the ink takes layer after layer. Um, you can see how different this is from the kind of naturalism in European painting. Um, there's a local color that painting directly from nature traps you into, and these are so um, uh, refined or cultivated images. And again, you know, look at the complexity that 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 happens in in these pieces. Um, you know, the gradients in different areas in the pieces, how that interplays. Um, you know, the scale of the marking, the scale of the figures, what's going on with them, you know, and there's still some pretty wacky things that go on in these pieces. I mean, there's also some backwards perspective that happens in some places, which is just fine. Um, but you know, the if we look at these figures that are, let me see, let me do the zoom in. Look at these figures that are up here on the top of the hill, and look at the size of these guys who are down the hill that are walking up there. And even these folks that are down here, in comparison, these guys are pretty tall. It's like a, you know, 9-foot person up there. And what's going on with these little houses over here, the little pagoda and all that stuff. Um, so they weren't chained to to trying to duplicate what's out there in nature. They're really trying to um, use large forms to simulate a kind of atmosphere. Gorgeous, tranquil, meditative pieces. This really speaks to the underlying philosophy behind these pieces. You know, this is a place of meditation. It's a place of calm, serenity. Hiroshige had a profound effect on many artists, and Monet was also one of them. He had a large collection, and actually he did delve into a bit of the philosophy behind these works. There's, you know, basically these woodcuts came out of a tradition. The earliest woodcuts were really Buddhist icons and all of that. I didn't include any of those because that's really not where the shows are that are out there. The show at Worcester is really concentrating on these woodcuts from the Edo period, and also the show that's going to be at the Boston Museum is from their fabulous collection, which is the bit actually. Worcester has the oldest collection of woodcut print wood block prints. They're really beautiful, and they have a fine collection of 3,700, where Boston has something along the lines of 34,000 prints, I believe is the number that I heard bandied about. But they have a huge collection. And in fact, it goes back to, the collection at Worcester was given to the museum in 1901, I believe. The collection at the Boston Museum was begun in 1907 or something like that. I believe that's when they started receiving some large quantities of prints from some collectors. They were bequeathed. So how was that philosophy integrated into the art world at that time? Arthur Wesley Dow was a teacher. He actually he studied in Paris in the 1870s, but was really not satisfied with the kind of realism that was going on around him at that time, and wanted to go deeper. And when he discovered the Japanese prints, he was transfixed by the subtlety, the nuance, but there was something in it. There was the philosophy behind it that he was really interested in pursuing. So he began to study Zen, began to study the Taoist notions that were behind these paintings. And there's something called notan, which he actually espoused, which is basically breaking down a composition into large areas of darks and lights, and making a balance, making a painting is essentially a rhythmic harmony of colors. Allow there to be space in a composition. Paint beautiful spaces. So Dow actually was a teacher. He was the head of the painting department at Columbia University for a period of time. But before that, he was actually one of the first curators of the Boston Museum's Japanese print collection. And so he was so familiar with what was in that collection, what was possible, and the nuance and the generosity of what was there and available to us. So he was a wonderful teacher. He actually taught a bunch of artists who became the early modernists, including Georgia O'Keeffe, who was one of his students. And so Arthur Wesley Dow, the Ipswich Museum or Historical Society. He was born in Ipswich, so he spent a lot of time in and out of Ipswich, especially when he was acting as the curator at the Boston Museum. And so they have a huge collection of his work there. But he also wrote a book, a very influential book on composition, in which he talks about this notan notion, where you break down the composition into nothing but darks and lights, and then you can go in with color into those big broad areas. And these are two contemporary artists. Neil Welliver, well, no longer with us, but this is a woodcut that was done by a team of printmakers in Japan. And again, this Alex Katz was also using Japanese printmakers to create the prints. There are many others who have been influenced by this, and the Boston Museum is doing this show that's actually going to show more specifically contemporary artists who have been influenced by the Japanese print. And this, there's a wonderful actually panel discussion on understanding Hiroshige, and the 100 views of Ito. Well worth looking at. It's about a year old at this point, but you can get to that YouTube. And then the Hokusai End of an Era from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Really wonderful, good sense of humor on this woman, and encyclopedic knowledge of the prints. And you know, with that, I humbly come to a close of my presentation. I have to say, I just, you know, there is so much more to this and so much depth to it. It could easily go on for hours, and does in these other presentations. So
Larry, we appreciate it. We know you weren't 100% today, so thank you very much.
Okay.
There's some thank yous in the chat function. I thank you for keeping it up, you know, doing this whole program. Someone is talking about the colors are so different from the muted blues, greens, browns, and oranges. So anyway, read the chats when you have a chance. And thank you all for coming.